Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased to join you today to offer these framing remarks for the Harnessing Potential Conference 2020. As United Nations Special Rapporteur on the protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, let me start with some global contextualization on the state of human rights around the world. Human rights protection and promotion is under severe and unrelenting strain. It's estimated that civic space is restricted in over 111 countries around the world. In 2019, over 300 human rights defenders, many of them women, were murdered in the course of engaging in advocacy for human rights and the defense of the rule of law. Torture, inhuman and degrading treatment remains widespread and institutionally tolerated. And as those of us, all of us in the middle of this pandemic know, human rights are an uphill struggle, all the more so in the middle of lockdowns and the use of exceptional powers around the globe. And yet, despite these enormous strains on claims for justice and dignity, the demands for justice and dignity by men, women, boys, and girls continue, and they remain visible and break through even in this time of pandemic. So the snapshots I offer are not generic. They are, in my view, intimately connected with and sustained by national security practices and the use of counterterrorism, security, and securitized approaches as normalized exceptions in multiple states across the world. So let me offer some more insight on some of the things that I think create the challenges we face today. The first is one that many in this audience will be more than familiar with, which is the weakening of the multilateral system, the United Nations and other multilateral fora, not only, but significantly because of their chronic underfunding, as well as the increased challenges and tensions we're seeing in these spaces, the increased role of security in dominating the conversations of these spaces, and the hierarchies in practice that are undermining the capacities of these institutions to work in concerted and cooperative ways. Here I particularly focus and call out the role of the Security Council, which has, in many ways, become a super legislature. That is all the more true when we look at the Security Council's role and its Chapter 7 resolutions since 2001 in the area of counterterrorism. And we see the securitization through the Security Council of complex issues that include governance, accountability, transparency, when security, while an important part of the conversation, should not be the dominant mode of engaging and addressing these challenging issues. A good example, I think, of this is what we're seeing in the Sahel region at the moment. The second issue I want to address is the backlash to human rights and the undermining of the rule of law and human rights-based approaches, which I've already sort of snapshotted for you in the introduction. But I think we're seeing that backlash to human rights in the ways in which human rights should be integrated in large, complex problem solving, but is often left out, and the ways in which human rights is left out or marginalized, sidelined, or underfunded, and all of the above in multilateral fora and frameworks. This is not unrelated to the rise of populist, nationalist, and authoritarian-style governments across the globe, many of whom have come to power precisely with a rhetoric and an approach that categorically denies the ways and the value of a human rights-based approach. I want to particularly highlight again the nexus between the backlash to human rights and the tightening of civic space and civil society actors around the world, and underscore the importance of opening up, sustaining, and defending civic space as the precursor to both secure and rule of law compliant states. Third, as I've already stated, but do want to say a little more about, is the rise of securitization as the primary motif of response to complex issues, which has been in evidence through the use of counterterrorism, security, and security-led approaches to many issues. The mandate I hold, increasingly see complex development, governance, and conflict issues, many of those conflict issues long-standing, deeply embedded, hard to undo, multiple actors and multiple causalities, being passed off as simply security problems, with what I call a bad actor syndrome dominating, meaning that the view is that if you deal with a few bad actors, you solve the complex problem. And those of us who have grown up or lived in conflicted societies know that this is simply not true, and undersells and underestimates the complexity of the problems and the solutions that are needed to address them. What that does is it cuts out both a complex and nuanced assessment of the problem, but also, in fact, evacuates the possibility for intersectional, complex approaches to insecurity, collective violence, and disruption. Fourthly, I think it's important at this time to speak to the relationship between climate harms, resource fragility around the globe, and violence in many countries. And again, the ways in which it's important to conceive of those three things in tandem, but also to understand that we need complex and nuanced interventions to address this issue. It worries me somewhat when I see a particularly dangerous conflation of climate change and security. Climate change as simply a security problem. And I recognize that, of course, climate poses security challenges, but we are not going to solve or address climate insecurity through a securitization model. Well, we may, in fact, continue to create some of the cycles of harm and prevent their disruption if that's the sort of simple, narrow approach that we take. It's important also that we talk about COVID-19. COVID-19 has us all on Zoom, and it has also had an enormous effect on human rights. It has, as we've seen, engaged and emboldened authoritarians and securocrats around the world. I note that my mandate issued an early warning with a number of other special procedure colleagues on the misuse of counterterrorism, security, and emergency measures in the context of COVID-19. In addition, with two NGOs, the ECNL and the ICNL, my mandate has created and supports a global tracker on the use of emergency legislation in the context of COVID-19. And it demonstrates a number of profoundly worrying trends in the appropriation of counterterrorism and security tools to respond to a health emergency. This includes, but is not limited to, the widespread use of data tracking, including the most sensitive data, biometric health data, without, in some contexts, any or sufficient protection on the collection, storage, use, or transfer of that data. I caution unreservedly about the flirtation with security frameworks and counterterrorism law as the basis of response to a global health pandemic. In conclusion, let me turn to a couple of potentially positive aspects. The positive human rights outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemic might include, I think, an emerging consensus on the right to health as a fundamental and undisputed right. Equally, I think we're having a different kind of conversation about the right to adequate housing and the right to water as fundamental and indisputable rights. It might also include a right to information as a safeguard to prevent the spread of disease across the planet. Again, I would say we're not well served in safeguarding global health by giving security actors alone, with limited oversight and even less transparency, the central role in managing a complex health crisis and the well-being of the populations who are affected by it. Finally, I suppose as we close on opportunities, I see extraordinary global organizing, even in the context of a global lockdown. I see enormous debate around rights, health and housing, obviously, but also the idea that the fundamental rights of persons is at stake, and that's what we're protecting during this pandemic. And there's a shift, perhaps, a positive shift in the global consensus on what rights count and what rights are rights. We have much work to do, and I hope that the pandemic spurs us in new and innovative directions rather than to entrench further the limitations on the rights of persons. And perhaps in this moment of global resetting, that we will recognize that rights and security are interdependent, indispensable to one another, and interrelated. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the conversation today.